We open with a black screen. An unknown narrator breaks the silence and begins recounting the story of philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who, on the 3rd of January in 1889, was walking through the streets of Turin where he witnessed a horse being beaten by its owner. Trying to end the brutal scene, Nietzsche threw himself around the neck of the poor creature, and sobbed heavily until he eventually collapsed into a breakdown from which he would never recover. Nietzsche never wrote again, and lived out the remaining 10 years of his life silent and demented. The story most likely isn't true, though it doesn't seem to matter much for the film that follows, as the narrator ends his monologue wondering not about what happened to Nietzsche, but rather about what happened to the horse. We cut to black and white footage of a farmer and his horse, struggling through the rough conditions of the road in a long, unbroken take, accompanied by a score that feels like the musical rendition of a factory, laboring on and on with an almost mechanical rhythm. If it feels like the world is coming to an end, it's because it is. In 6 days, it will all be over. This is the Turin horse. It's an apocalyptic tale of anti-creation, an exemplification of one of the most complicated and controversial existential philosophies, and the culmination of the career of one of the most fascinating filmmakers in cinematic history. It will be another 20 minutes or so before we hear the first real line of dialogue. I've been trying to make sense of the films of Hungarian director Béla Tarr for a long time. Though he had been making feature films since the late 70s, it arguably wasn't until his 1988 film Damnation that he would adopt the stylistic and narrative approach that he is now most well known for. The approach that would come to define what I generally considered his greatest, most renowned works: Satantango, Werckmeister Harmonies, and the Turin horse. If you've heard of Béla Tarr before, you probably have some impression of what this approach looks like from a presentational point of view. Mainly black and white photography, bleak and almost dystopian environments, often set in the Hungarian countryside. Extremely slow-paced storytelling and long takes. But when looking at the meaning of it all, at the deeper themes of his stories, things get a little bit more complicated. Because the thing about Tarr's films is that they are just so unconventional. Satantango, for example, is 7 hours and 19 minutes long. When I first came across it about 10 years ago, it felt like the white whale of cinema. A film that was just taunting you with its sheer size, but which you couldn't so easily escape from either. For besides being deemed notoriously challenging, laborious, and painstakingly slow, it was also hailed as a masterpiece that, as a true cinephile, you had to have seen at least once in your life. Even now, I think that for many film fanatics, watching Satantango is like reading Infinite Jest. It's a rite of passage, one that gives you a sense of victory in the mere accomplishment of simply having made your way through it, regardless of whether you enjoyed it or even understood what was going on. Because that's the other thing about the unconventionality of Tarr's films. They do not only test your patience, but also seem to undermine the most basic assumptions and expectations that most of us have internalized when it comes to comprehending stories. I'll get into this in more detail later on, but one unexpected realization I had while exploring Tarr's work for this video is that the question of what his films are about almost feels less relevant than the issue of why and how we pose that question in the first place. Because although this age of online film journalism and critical video essays has been, in my opinion, a generally good thing for our overall media literacy, it also feels like we've slowly come to homogenize the way we look at films, developed a collectively agreed upon framework about how stories function, how they should function. We generally take this for granted because most films are made with that same framework in mind and therefore don't really call attention to it. It's only when you encounter the work of someone like Béla Tarr, someone who genuinely steps outside of the conventional boundaries, that you experience friction. At this point, you can offer a critique based on how films like these don't fit the standard, so to say. But you can also use them to interrogate that standard, and perhaps even to change it. And today, perhaps more than anything, that's what I want to try and do. Because even though I believe there's plenty to say about the work of Béla Tarr in more traditional terms, his narrative structures, his recurring themes, and his deeper philosophical influences, all of which I'll certainly get into, I would be selling his work short if I did not also address how he genuinely made me question my entire approach to story analysis. And so with that, let's begin our journey into the cinema of Béla Tarr, explore what kinds of stories he tells and how he tells them, and examine the real impact of the work of this Hungarian director who quietly altered not just the way I look at his films, but the way I look at cinema as a whole. This video was brought to you by Mubi, which in the US and the UK is now showing, among many other amazing films, Béla Tarr's The Turin Horse. So after this video, be sure to go to mubi.com/likestoriesofold to receive an extended free trial and to see for yourself the work of this fascinating filmmaker.
Itt csoszognak a pusztulásban. Távol mindattól, ami az élet. Terveik kudarcba fullnak, álmaik vakon zúzódnak szét. Valami csodára várnak, ami sohasem fog bekövetkezni.
If I had to briefly summarize what the films of Béla Tarr are about, I'd say they are about worlds in decay, and about the human beings who seem immobilized within them. They cannot move forward, cannot escape their fate, and yet standing still is not an option either. For as they try to isolate themselves or try to secure something solid, the world around them stays in motion, and will soon render their efforts futile. In Damnation, there's a recurring visual motif of a cable car moving coal out of a soon-to-be depleted mining village. As far as the characters who live there are concerned, they might as well fade away into the distance. For them, the cars go nowhere. They provide no ticket out of the dying community. All they seem to do with their slow but unrelenting movement high above the ground is form a cruel contrast to the humanity that remains in stasis down in the mud. One reason why Satantango is almost 7.5 hours long is because it's deliberately structured in such a way that the story hardly progresses. We'll see a sequence from one character's perspective, only to then revert back to see it from another. Characters learn slowly, and when they do, any action they undertake is more likely to set their lives back rather than move them forward. In this dilapidated town, they too find themselves stuck, trapped in what feels like an eternal tango. One step forward, 2 steps back. This sense of being both immobilized and damned is perhaps most clearly visualized in Werckmeister Harmonies, in which a community is visited by a mysterious circus that presents as its main attraction the corpse of a giant whale. The circus, however, also brings another strange figure that eventually upsets the community and tears it to pieces. As the drama unfolds, the giant whale remains firmly in place, left to slowly rot away in the middle of the now ravaged town square. Considering how Hungary was still part of and struggling with the Soviet Union, there is obviously a wealth of political readings here regarding the implications of oppressive regimes, the search for national identity, and also the dangers of fascism, which in Werckmeister Harmonies is depicted in an especially interesting way, because though the story revolves around a supposedly fascist outsider, a man who is simply known as the Prince, we as the audience do not get to see him at all. We do not hear his ideas, we do not get any insight in how he persuaded the villagers. We only see the shadow he casts, we see the consequences, and the destructiveness and absurdity of what happens when humanity is discarded for fanaticism. But what personally interests me the most about Tarr's work is that his films transcend political commentary. They do not just relate to a specific time and place in history. There is a deeper, a more timeless quality to them that makes them universally relevant and profoundly relatable to everyone. As Tarr himself once explained, "At the beginning of my career I had a lot of social anger. I just wanted to tell you how f***ed up the society is. This was the beginning. Afterwards I began to understand that the problems were not only social, they are deeper, they were cosmic." In Tarr's films we indeed see social structures that collapse and communities that fall into decline, but it is all presented with a distinct sensation, like a faint yet gnawing awareness at the back of your mind telling you that here nothing survives. Flesh decays until it eventually perishes, stones erode until they eventually crumble. The entire universe is entropy. The entire universe is damned.
Mert minden tönkrement. Minden lealjasodott.
In this sense, Tarr's films are not just political, they are existential. They are concerned with how we relate ourselves to the fundamentals of life, to our own human condition, and to what meaning, if any, there is to it. His final film, The Turin Horse, is perhaps the purest example of this, described by Tarr as just a simple anti-creation story. In The Turin Horse we witness 6 days in the lives of a farmer, his daughter, and their horse. Each day they get up, they go about their work, they joylessly nourish themselves with a potato and some salt, and they go back to bed. As we follow this dreadful routine, the world around them slowly collapses. The crickets stop chirping, the horse refuses to eat and eventually dies. The well dries up, storms of dust ravage the land until, finally, all light is extinguished, leaving our desperate farmers in ultimate darkness. But there is something peculiar about Tarr's films as existential works, which might be the reason why he generally doesn't tend to be included when people, including myself in an earlier video, talk about existential filmmakers. Because unlike for example Andrei Tarkovsky, Ingmar Bergman or Terrence Malick, the work of Béla Tarr distinguishes itself by not appealing to God, not even in a metaphorical sense. His characters experience no apparent crises of faith, never seem to be on an explicit quest for ultimate meaning. They don't seem to be concerned with any form of direct existential questioning. There are a few mentions of God here and there, but they feel like they are referring to a past tense. Or to put it like this, in the cinematic worlds of Béla Tarr, it appears that God is history, that, as Nietzsche notoriously declared, that God is dead.
Csak átlagott értetlenül, bele nem törődve. Tudja még valami? Az a vihar, az ész felől meg nem világosította őket. Akkor viszont már egy csapásra rájöttek, hogy se Isten, se istenek. Akkor már egy csapásra fölfogták, hogy se jó, se rossz.
Aside from a general familiarity through popular culture, I have to admit that I knew very little about the actual philosophy of Nietzsche before I started working on this video. And even now, after weeks of researching his books and about 25 hours of listening to the Nietzsche podcast, I still feel like I'm barely a novice. Because the tricky thing about Nietzsche's philosophy is that, unlike pretty much any other philosopher that came before him, he wasn't really concerned with developing an organized system of thought. He didn't seem to have the same desire of wanting to capture reality into a confined, all-encompassing understanding. As a result, there is a certain chaotic, almost reckless quality to his writings, and reading it is as insightful as it is confusing, as profound as it is misguided, and as soothing as it is provocative. But fortunately for me, when it comes to illuminating certain aspects of the films of Béla Tarr, I don't think we have to grasp Nietzsche in its entirety. From what I found, the Nietzschean influence on Tarr's work, an influence that he has explicitly mentioned by the way, seems to be limited to a relatively small selection of Nietzsche's ideas, with probably the most notable one being the death of God. Though widely quoted and referred to, Nietzsche's statement that God is dead nevertheless demands some elaboration. In essence, what he really implied was that, thanks to the Enlightenment, the general idea of God had lost its believability. This wasn't to say that Christianity was over, or that people would or could no longer believe, even quite fervently, in God anymore. Rather, he argued that the existence of God, and to some extent the Christian worldview in general, was no longer the immutable and unquestionable assumption at the heart of our metaphysical reality, and that as a consequence we could no longer ground our beliefs, our moral values, our entire sense of selves in this external foundation with the same unwavering certainty as we did before. To put it simply, the death of God forced us to truly consider our existence without reflexively appealing to any higher realm or being that would explain, justify, and validate it for us. Throughout the work of Béla Tarr, there is a palpable atmosphere that radiates a kind of irreparable desperation. His characters do not just live in run-down villages and crumbling communities. They inhabit a shattered illusion.
De miféle végzet áldozatai maguk? Talán a futaki barátunk által unalomig ismételgetett, omló vakolatokról, letarolt tetőkről, nem inkább a letarolt távlatokról, összeomló képzeletről, megrodjant térdekről és a teljes cselekvés képtelenségről kéne beszélni.
And this is what they respond to. and where they reveal their true desires. For although I mentioned Tarr's characters do not directly seek out God, they do seem to feel the void of a godless world, or more generally, the void of a world without truth, without collective identity, without that solid foundation from which they can derive a strong sense of moral or psychological footing, a strong sense of self. And this makes them fundamentally vulnerable and alone.
Létrehozok egy szigetet, ami megszünteti a kiszolgáltatottságot, ahol mindenki békében és nyugalomban, biztonságban és emberhez méltón fogja majd esténként álomra hajtani a fejét.
There is a thing that Nietzsche does in his writings that Tarr also does in his films, and that is to deliver important messages and themes indirectly, and often rather vaguely, through ambiguous characters, thereby undermining their assumed validity.
Habozás nélkül szembe kell fordulnunk a hangszerhangolás fejlődésének szomorú kísértet históriájával, az úgynevezett egyenletes temperálással, és vissza kell állítanunk a természetes hangolás jogát.
In Werckmeister Harmonies, for example, is the sentimental man who is lamenting the modern way of tuning instruments, courtesy of Andreas Werckmeister, giving us a real insight into history having taken a wrong turn. Or is he just a nostalgic fool deluding himself into believing that there is a magical past to return to where things were definitively better, that we can undo the death of God, so to say? Or in The Turin Horse is the rambling man who claims what feels like 90% of the film's dialogue as he visits the farmer for a bottle of brandy a truth-sayer? Is he someone who insightfully contextualizes the farmer's plight in philosophical terms? Or is he just a drunk in need of some spirit, someone to be taken as seriously as any lonely man in a bar who starts venting at the wall after a drink too many?
Mindent meg is rontottak. Amihez ezek hozzájutottak, azt megrontották. Márpedig...
The immediate effect of having every hope for truth made questionable and every glimmer of overarching meaning undermined is that we are firmly placed in the limited perspectives of the characters. And it is because of that that we can begin to understand what makes their lives so tragically difficult. For Tarr's characters, the death of God is perhaps above all a disconnecting force, one that isolates individuals into a harsh material reality that slowly eats away at their bodies and will soon have them whole, and that makes them vulnerable to everyone else they encounter. For with each desire acted upon, with each new meeting, there is the same uncertainty. Are these the promises of a liberator, or the deceptions of a false prophet? Is this a chance for love, or yet another dead end that will leave us more desperate than we were at the start? Will this person save our community, or lead to its ruin?
Ez ment. Évszázadokon át. Ment és ment. Csak ez ment. Néha suttyomban. Néha durván. Néha finoman. Néha brutálisan. Ment. Csak ment.
But although it is easy to interpret all this as expressions of pessimism, of hopelessness, and perhaps even of misanthropy, as Tarr remarked, someone who is that cynical about humanity would not be making films about it. Indeed, the point of all this is not to bring you down, not necessarily at least. Rather, it's an invitation, and in some ways even an appeal. There is another Nietzschean concept that, in my opinion, effectively and quite beautifully explains the true implications behind the death of God, or at least that helps us to properly contextualize it for a better understanding of the films of Béla Tarr, and that's the idea of eternal recurrence. In essence, Nietzsche's eternal recurrence suggests that after we die, our lives simply start over, and then play out again in the exact same way. To quote the extended passage from The Gay Science, "What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you in your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god," and never have I heard anything more divine? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and every thing, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal? It's a rather poetic description, but what I think he's really proposing here is not so much a scientific perspective on the objective nature of reality. He's not literally suggesting that our lives are replayed on an endless loop. It's not a commentary on determinism or individual agency. Rather, it's more of a thought experiment in which he tries, like Tarr does in his films, to force us to truly regard our world and our existence as it is, and to find meaning in what we directly know and experience. This obviously means to discard all escapes into faith, in which life tends to be seen as a passage towards something else, be it reincarnation, heaven, or some other spiritual realm, and in which meaning tends to be handed down from above or from beyond what we know. But in a way, the concept of eternal recurrence also goes beyond more atheist perspectives by denying us the escape into death as well. In other words, in our quest for meaning and our general understanding of what it means to be human, we cannot appeal to any form of external resolution, not even oblivion. And so, what eternal recurrence really implies is a radical grounding in the here and now, an imagined fate to make us question who we would be, how we would act, if all there ever was and will be was this. No guiding stars, no salvation, no escape. I know just this world, what we have now, Tarr once said, and I know only one thing. This is our creation. If this world is shit, that's what we could do. If this world is beautiful, that's also what we could do. And this perhaps is the real challenge, not just to truly come to terms with the limited nature of our existence and to stop looking for answers beyond it, but also to try and find a way to navigate our lives without such answers. If this truly is our world, if this truly is all there is, can we still make it beautiful? What source, what point of reference do we have to ground our values and beliefs in? Can there be a true system of ethics without basing it on supposedly divine principles? Can we even claim any objective knowledge at all?
De ha így van, kegyetlen velünk az élet.
Like Nietzsche, Tarr seems to understand the weight of these questions, the steep uphill climb that's in front of him. Because when we take that hard look at our world and at ourselves, and we see the real bleakness, the despair, the violence that's inflicted on us by the elements, by nature, by our social systems and by ourselves, all of it without apparent meaning or purpose, it certainly feels like the more relevant question is, how do we not lose our humanity? Tarr offers no clear answers, but he does define an important boundary, which is best depicted in Werckmeister Harmonies, and which is arguably one of the most powerful moments in Tarr's entire filmography. Here we follow a group of enraged men, riled up by the fascist outsider, as they violently trash their local hospital. After a prolonged sequence of continued devastation and inhumanity, the mob is suddenly stopped dead in its track at the side of an old man, standing naked and alone. The sounds of destruction make way for an evocative musical track, and the men quietly exit the premises. The scene shows how as we stumble and fall, as we corrupt ourselves, degrade ourselves, as we cause hurt and pain, and end up suffering all the more for it, there is a point where we can go no further, a point where we are completely stripped down from everything, where all that we are is fully laid bare. And that's when we see it. That's when we come face to face with the one truth that we can know and act upon with certainty. As Tarr himself put it,
one thing is important, the human dignity. and please don't touch it, the human dignity. Please don't destroy, please don't humiliate. And I just wanted to show you always, here is some poor, ugly, sad people. Maybe they are able to do crimes, but they are able to love each other, but they are human beings, and they have a right for the life.
And this, I think, is essential to understanding the films of Béla Tarr. In the end, they're not about invoking despair about living a dreadful existence in bleak, desolate landscapes. They are, as Lila Toke wrote in a research paper about Béla Tarr, about pushing the viewer towards a universal and ethical affirmation of humanism. And while I certainly believe that this is a beautiful message in its own right, where Tarr truly distinguishes himself for me as one of the greats is not necessarily because of what he has to say, but rather because of how he says it. Or better yet, because of how he makes you feel it. So far we've mostly been covering the content of the stories of Béla Tarr, the deeper meanings, the philosophical influences. But while that definitely gives us some insight in what his films are about, it doesn't fully tell us how they are about these things. It doesn't really explain the form, not completely at least. And this is something that is also important to discuss because, as I mentioned in the introduction, Béla Tarr has a very distinct way of filmmaking, one that in many ways defies conventional methods of critical analysis, and that made me genuinely reconsider some aspects of my own way of looking at films. Now, I'm not saying that Tarr's methods are completely unbound from generally accepted filmmaking standards. Standards that suggest things like it's better to show than tell, that screen time is to be used efficiently, and that every individual element has to feel purposeful, meaningful to the overall story. For you can definitely attach such motivations to Tarr's filmmaking choices, but every time you do so, he seems to push just beyond it. He always seems to make sure that whatever interpretation you offer, you never quite capture it whole. You could argue, for example, that the wandering cows who have broken free from their enclosures in the opening shot of Satantango serve to symbolize the villagers who find themselves similarly dislocated and lost. But could you also argue for that shot having to be 8 minutes long? Similarly, you could argue that the exhausting monotony of watching the farmers repeat the same day over and over again in the Turin horse is actually the intended experience, that it is specifically designed to make us truly inhabit the draining routine that the characters go through. But then again, how long does that repetition really have to go on for us to get the point? It's no secret that Tarr likes to take his time. We see that clearly in his use of long takes. And by long takes I mean really, really long takes. I could compare the average shot length from a Tarr film to that of a modern action film, which tends to be about 1 to 3 seconds. But even when placed next to other works that I generally considered slow-paced, take for example Fellini's 8.5, which has an average shot length of 10.9 seconds, or Kubrick's The Shining, which pushes slightly beyond that with 12.9 seconds. Tarr boasts an incredible 145.7 seconds in Satantango, which he then almost doubled in the Turin horse, which has an average shot length of 300 seconds. And those are real shots, mind you, not the artificially stitched together kind as we so often see nowadays. But the big elephant in the room when it comes to ambiguous filmmaking choices is of course Satantango, which besides having a long average shot length also comes with that notorious runtime of 7 hours and 19 minutes. Ever since its release in 1994, the one question that comes up time and time again is why? Why is it that long? Is the story really so special that it could not possibly be told within a more conventional length? When I first watched the film about 8 years ago, I ended up watching it in multiple parts, but this time around I wanted to challenge myself and watch the whole thing in one sitting. Now, the interesting thing about watching a 7.5-hour movie is that it immediately hits you as a logistical issue, because you don't just sit down and put it on, no, you pretty much have to schedule an entire day for it. You have to prepare meals, account for bathroom breaks, and you have to make sure you are absolutely comfortable. And I actually kind of liked all that. I liked the intentionality and the anticipation of it all. It's like the film forces you to take this seriously, to treat it like an event, which does affect your state of mind going into it. But as for the film itself, I was of course secretly hoping that the experience would reveal some profound hidden insight, some justification for its length that cannot be gained from watching it in 2 or more parts. But honestly, I'm not sure that I can say that it did. Maybe? It's almost impossible to explain it in a way that truly makes sense from a critical perspective, because while I cannot argue that Satantango absolutely needed to be 7.5 hours long, I also cannot argue that it would have had the same impact if it was only half its length. For the thing is, when you watch a film like this, you disconnect yourself not just from your literal world as you take out that entire day to spend it in this story, but eventually you also detach yourself from the framework through which you usually watch and comprehend films. Because even if you're confused or even annoyed at first, even as you get bored or disinterested, as the hours go by and your brain becomes tired, at some point you just start to let go. You stop analyzing everything so much, stop thinking about everything so much, and you just become quietly entranced. I don't care about stories. I never did, Béla Tarr once said. Every story is the same, we have no new stories, we're just repeating the same ones. I really don't think, when you do a movie, that you have to think about the story. The film isn't the story. It's mostly picture, sound, a lot of emotions. The stories are just covering something. I have been thinking a lot about what that really means, because although it's nothing new to separate story from atmosphere, I'm not sure if that's exactly what's going on here. I wouldn't really describe Tarr's films as tone poems or mood pieces. They feel deeper than that, more moving, more significant than any particular vibe would be able to communicate. I'm not sure I can articulate this in a way that would make his films suddenly make complete sense in conventional terms. And that might be exactly the point. Maybe they shouldn't. So often we tend to approach films as puzzles to be dissected, regardless of what kind of story they tell. In this online culture of video essays and film analysis particularly, we generally want to know how A leads to B, how X invokes Y, and as a consequence, we've come to assume that every element of a film has to contain some secret key that unlocks a hidden meaning or means to an end purposefulness, which in turn makes us more likely to dismiss certain elements or fault the film in its entirety when we cannot find one. And again, I don't think this is an altogether bad thing. In fact, I think that this video has shown quite clearly that even with unconventional films, critical analysis can still help us to contextualize them in such a way that they, at least for me, become more accessible, more meaningful, and more enjoyable. But while reviewing Tarr's films, I've also become aware of the limitations of this approach. I came to realize just how much dissections like these tend to overlook that more ineffable quality that films can have. A kind of intuitive resonance that can connect with us deeply and intimately, and invoke emotions beyond our conscious understanding, which is something that very few filmmakers know how to cultivate, and which is what to me makes Béla Tarr a true artist. Because even though I've seen plenty of avant-garde, unconventional and abstract films in the years since I first encountered Tarr's work, his films stayed with me in a way that many of those other films did not. And I know that's not because of his intricate plots, his compelling characters, or because of his philosophical influences, but specifically because of how his films moved me emotionally. And I don't mean that in the melodramatic sense, but rather in a truly experiential one. In truly feeling the bleakness of a desperate landscape, the tragedy of broken communities, but also in truly feeling that deep sense of humanity, not only in those grander moments, but also in the many smaller ones that can be found in between and beyond the quote-unquote story. Moments that are intensified precisely because Tarr really lets us sit with them, really lets them connect with our own inner feelings, our own pain, our helplessness, loneliness, our longing for love, for prosperity, our longing to belong, to feel joy, to have a relief, even if only for a moment, from the heaviness of existence. And at the end of it all, it is in that act of deep synergy that Tarr also allows us to really affirm for ourselves that one thing that we can hold on to. That one thing which for Tarr matters the most. To quote Lila Toke again, Tarr's entire artistic oeuvre in fact testifies to the existence of the outsider in all of us, in our utter isolation and displacement at the mercy of unforgiving social, economic and even physical conditions. Under these circumstances, it is human dignity as well as a relentless search for intimacy and connection which demarcate our last remaining sense of humanity. This video was brought to you by Mubi, the curated streaming service which in the US and the UK is now showing the Turin Horse. Though it's Béla Tarr's final feature film, it's also his most pure, most distilled one, and it might just be my favorite. On Mubi you will also find a vast library of other great films from iconic directors to emerging auteurs, with each and every one of them being carefully hand-selected to provide you with the best that cinema has to offer. And if you go to mubi.com/likestoriesofold, you can try Mubi for free for 30 days. So be sure to claim your extended free trial to experience for yourself the Turin Horse and all the other great films presented to you by Mubi.